All right. Good morning, everyone. It's rainy. It's about 50, 60 degrees outside. Very much a gloomy Jane Eyre type of morning. And so it's a good time to discuss Jane Eyre and the Gothic. What do I mean by Gothic? I'm not talking about the way that it exists in pop culture today as sort of an anti-pop type of stance where, people you think of Gothic as dressing in black and black fingernail polish and lots of eye makeup and listening to certain music. Okay, well, that's all fine and good, but let's go back to the origins of the Gothic, especially just like artistic movements, they cross pollinate through all different artistic disciplines. Gothic architecture is something that um, sort of predates the Gothic novel, certainly. But in literature, you see some artists, especially in the Romantic era, creating Gothic novels. And so we'll talk about exactly what makes a novel a Gothic novel. And we'll talk about why Jane Eyre is matches up with that category, and what was Charlotte Bronte's intention in using the elements of the Gothic novel to create this big masterpiece. And just to clarify, and I don't want anyone to get too confused about these different terms and categories out there. When you think about Romanticism, the way that we talked about it in Bewick's History of British Birds, the Gothic is just a sort of a subcategory or subgenre of Romanticism. Okay, so you have Romanticism is sort of a broader movement, and within that you have appearing the Gothic, and in this case, the Gothic novel. Okay, so before we go into what makes a novel Gothic, let's just talk a little bit about where the novel even came from. Okay, because um, you know there was a time when for entertainment these things didn't exist. Um, only the upper class and the educated were able to get their hands on books, and up until the 1700s, you had only the classic manuscripts. You may have been able to read legendary like the King Arthur stories in Mallory's Le Morte d'Arthur. There were certainly the big epic poems that were out there and studied. There's a lot of epic poetry. The things that we read in Brit Lit last year, like Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, that was a romance novella, like a short novel, and not necessarily intended to be mass produced and enjoyed by a more common group of people. But as the printing press came along and as literacy went up on the rise, it does make sense that there would be a demand for more things to read. And the novel became an answer to that. So let's look at some of the early, the origins of where the novel came from. Okay, arguably the first novel, but there's so many different cases to be made for different texts as being the first novel. But I like this one because most people have heard about the adventures of Robinson Crusoe and how he was shipwrecked and he lived for decades on an island, and he sort of wrote down his life story, and it was published just like this: The Life and Strange Surprising Adventures of Robinson Crusoe of York, Mariner, who lived 20 years all alone in an uninhabited island on the coast of America, near the mouth of the great river of Orunque, etc., etc., etc. Something about pirates. Okay, that's exciting already. I want to read this. This was marketed and written in a way as so as to come off as true. People who first bought this book and read this book, there was no way of fact checking so well on the internet, and people actually, thought, oh, this must be a true story. In fact, it might have been based on something. There might have been some truth, like tales of people getting stranded, because there was a lot of exploration going on. But it's, it was absolutely fiction. But that was one of the interesting twists that came with the origin of the novel, that a lot of people, I think, were a little more excited if the novel was real. So that, the proper fictional novel, as a category, didn't quite exist yet. Later on, we can look back and categorize Robinson Crusoe as fiction, but technically it was, yes, fiction, but marketed to be real, written to be taken seriously as something that actually did happen, thus giving it a little bit more excitement and mystery and etc. So, but yeah, we know now that it would fall under the category fiction. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the origins of the novel genre. And I want to just add this term here. Romance. Okay, not to be confused with the Romantic era. A romance would be something like a legend about, or a series of legends about King Arthur. Sir Gawain and the Green Knight was a short work, a novella, not a novel. A novella that was termed a romance. The Tempest is often called a romance, or a tragic comedy / one of Shakespeare's romances. Okay, these are of a different category, and the romance was what you saw leading up into the 1700s as one of the main fictional genres that was being produced. So Walter Scott defined romance as a fictitious narrative in prose or verse, the interest of which turns upon marvelous and uncommon incidents. Okay, so if you think of Gawain and the Green Knight, certainly there is the marvelous and the uncommon and the supernatural, etc. Now, he says the novel develops and changes a wee bit when it starts incorporating into the text events that are accommodated to the ordinary train of human events and the modern state of society. So when we think about Robinson Crusoe and its intention to sort of match up with reality, okay, it was meant to be this true story set in a very interesting time period when there was a lot of exploring going on and sort of an encounter. The Columbian exchange at large was still happening, so there is this intersection between the Western world and the New World. A lot of interesting things happening there. It was, a major part of discussion, I'm sure, in society at the time. So here we have a book that deals with those sort of real life instances. Okay, Walter Scott, though, goes on to say, however, many romances, including the historical romances of Scott, Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights and Herman Melville's Moby Dick, are frequently called novels, and Scott describes romance as a kindred term. Romance, as defined here, should not be confused with a genre. Fiction, love... I must have mistyped that. Romance, as defined here, should not be confused with a genre. Fiction, love, romance, or romance novel. Other European languages do not distinguish between romance and novel. A novel is le roman, de roman, etc. The word novella or novelle, however, is used in most European languages to describe a long short story or a short novel. Okay, so although we, at the beginning of the paragraph, wanted to make a distinction between the romance and the novel, as in the romance is highly fictitious, even marvelous, uncommon, perhaps even supernatural. And then the novel is something that's exploring things that are more real and germane to human events in modern society. There are still some novels that take on elements of the romance, in that they have an air about them that is sort of maybe magical or mysterious, uncanny. So I'll just try my best to organize all of these things. In the early days, you had your romance. Okay, we're talking Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, The Tempest, Le Morte d'Arthur, legends and such that one would read that were, highly fictitious and entertaining, and often very short, or not necessarily wrapped up into one single unit neatly the way that a novel is. Okay, after that period, in the 1700s, you have emerged things that are imitating reality and taking on a sort of singular form, and that would be Robinson Crusoe, and then later on Jane Eyre. But that's not to say that some of these later novels did not still retain some elements of the romance. So you have romance, then the novel sort of emerging from there, and then the novel developing a little bit more with elements of what is described as the romance. So you might be wondering then, where does the Gothic and the Romantic era come to play? Well, Robinson Crusoe was very much not necessarily influenced or product of the Romantic era. It was still, maybe very much a precursor. It just had a different intention behind it. Bronte, a little bit more modern, and as I said earlier, not only is she, maybe the Jane Eyre is categorized in the Romantic era, but specifically Bronte is making it a Gothic piece of literature, okay, which falls into the category of Romanticism. And just to reiterate, Romanticism valued emotion, nature, the supernatural. It was dramatic. It was full of action. Okay, Gothic has some very specific elements to it. Gloomy settings, okay, often with castles, hidden passages, subterranean layers. That's very much a hallmark of the Gothic. Okay, remote landscapes. Okay, violence, interesting. Altered mental states. Mysterious occurrences. An atmosphere of fear and suspense. Okay, so I hope that you're jogging through your brain and seeing how these Gothic elements fit in Jane Eyre, what we've read so far.